Having said that, I differ substantially from centrists, both of the center left and the center right, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom and also in the European Union, who dismiss the Trumpist team as a bunch of buffoons who don't know what they're doing. You asked me about tariffs, or you mentioned tariffs. Yeah. I see a very clear plan in what they're doing. I'm not saying it was going to work, but I think that it is highly irresponsible of critics of Trump to dismiss them as a bunch of idiots. If you read their texts, if you listen to the smart people in the team, like Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, there is a very clear analysis, which actually is not wrong, regarding the imbalances, the gross imbalances of the world economy, with the United States being at the center of it. And if you read their analysis of what they are trying to do, not of the means by which they're trying to achieve it, of what they're trying to do, I actually find myself in agreement with them. So when they say that there is a clear and present danger that the dollar world, which is so inflated compared to the capacity of the United States economy to manufacture stuff, this huge imbalance is a bubble waiting to burst. And then when it bursts, it's not that China will overtake America or anything like that, but we're all going to have a crisis that will make 2008 look like a walk in the park. They're right in that. And that the world needs to be rebalanced. They're right in that. Whereas, the Biden administration, the European Union, cabal in Brussels, Keir Starmer here, Rishi Sunak before them, they have absolutely nothing interesting to say. Nothing that is analytically pertinent about the growing dangerous imbalances in the world. The tragedy, of course, is that the people who are putting their finger on the wound that global,
which you say is a real wound.
It is a real wound, are the ones who are proposing measures that are more likely than not to bring about, the crisis that they're warning us about.
Well, tell us about that crisis, because what you're saying is, yes, there is a problem. Yes, they have a coherent plan, but you don't approve of them, or the means. You think the means are wrong and probably destructive. Is it the fact of imposing big tariffs, or is it simply the huge uncertainty they're
Tariffs are irrelevant. Are a means to an end, even for them. Maybe Trump loves tariffs, but the team around him, it's very clear that to them, it is just a weapon to terrorize everybody in order to get what they want. And what they want, let me be very clear and succinct here. They want two things that sound contradictory, but they are not necessarily contradictory. They can be, but they are not necessary. They want to devalue the dollar by 30% in order to shrink the American trade deficit and rebalance the world economy. That's not a bad idea. But what they also want at the same time is to keep the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar. And that sounds incongruous, doesn't it? You want to devalue the dollar, but to maintain its power. Now, the only way they can do that is by blackmailing the Japanese, for instance, who have $1.2 trillion of savings, to get rid of half of them, to sell them in order to increase the supply of dollars to reduce its price, but not to buy euros, not to buy the Chinese currency, not to buy anything that could compete with the US dollar, and to buy instead long-term American debt, or to bring the money to the United States. Now, this is what they're using the tariffs for, at least the Trumpian team. They're using it in order to extract different things from different people. From the Germans, for instance, they want to say, okay, if you want to have any degree of trade with us, you have to allow BASF and Siemens and Volkswagen to shift their manufacturing plants to the United States. From the French, they want other stuff. So they want this one-on-one bilateral divide and rule based bargaining around. And I very much fear that they will singularly fail to achieve that, especially given that China is not going to budge.
Well, China was what I was going to come on to immediately, because China holds a vast amount of dollar-denominated...
$4.5 trillion.
Yeah, extraordinary amounts. Yeah. And China has been, I would say, the big focus of tariffs, really. I mean, that's where the key ones have been, and the key ones have been lifted or suspended.
Yeah.
Is it going to work with China? What effect is it going to have on that huge relationship between the world's two biggest economic powers?
Well, China has been planning for a long time. They have seen this coming. Not necessarily for Trump, but remember, Trump is not that much of an outlier in American politics. Remember when Biden came in, many of us thought, me too, and I have to say erroneously, we thought that he was going to undo the new Cold War that Trump had started, and instead Biden turbocharged it. So let's not fall into the trap of thinking that, if Trump loses the elections and in the midterms and then the Democrat comes in, this is not going to be reversed. It's exactly. There's a very interesting and very serious aspect to this reserve that he's pushing forward, which has nothing to do with anything of what I said. And if I'm allowed to just explain what that is, look, Donald Trump and the very serious thinkers that he's got in his economics team, and I'm saying this as a very harsh and fierce critic of him and his team. So, we need to understand and not to dismiss our opponent as a buffoon when he may look like a buffoon, walk like a buffoon, but he's not a buffoon when it comes to his economic policy.
Right.
Look, his long-term project to bring manufacturing back to the United States involves a very delicate exercise. On the one hand, he wants to reduce the value of the dollar, the exchange rate between the dollar and the sterling, the euro, and so on. He wants to bring it down in order to make American exports more competitive and imports into the United States more expensive, and therefore shift jobs back to the Midwest, let's say. At the same time, and that's why I'm saying it's delicate, he wants to maintain the hegemony of the dollar.
Right.
So he doesn't want some other currency to replace the exorbitant privilege that the dollar affords anyone who happens to be in the White House. And the way so how is this connected to Bitcoin and to the reserve, the strategic reserve? For the dollar to fall, he needs the Chinese, the Japanese, the Brits, and the Europeans, primarily, to sell many of their dollars, of their hoarded bucks, greenbacks. But he doesn't want them to buy the Chinese currency. He doesn't want them to buy the euro. He doesn't want them to buy the British pound, because that would defeat the purpose. So if he can create a flow of capital from the American dollar to a melange of cryptocurrencies, and especially if these cryptocurrencies are backstopped through some kind of stable coin, as it's called, the currency board, by the US dollar, he's achieved his objective. That, I think, is what is really lying at the heart of the thinking behind establishing this strategic reserve of cryptocurrencies. It's highly possible. There were two moves that have already done that. One was when Wall Street started establishing trading platforms for Bitcoin. In other words, this is the great irony, isn't it? Bitcoin was established as an anti-Wall Street, anti-establishment currency. But however, the great fillip, the great boost in its value came when the establishment embraced it. That already has happened from the perspective of Wall Street. And the second one is the strategic reserve. So anything that increases the demand of anything, increases its price, and creates speculatory flow of capital into it. So in that sense, you may be right. But on the other hand, because these cryptocurrencies do not reflect any intrinsic value whatsoever, trying to predict their value is like a cat chasing its own tail, because it's like, average opinion, trying to imagine what average opinion will be. It sounds a bit absurd, doesn't it, to have this hypothesis and to put it about, until you home in on the actual hypothesis, which is that capital has triumphed. Absolutely, it has steamrolled over organized labor, the trade unions movement, the social democracy, even liberalism. And its triumph has been so complete that, like a toxic virus, it mutated into a new form of capital. That has never happened before in the history of humanity for the last 20,000 years. Capital was always produced means of production. That is, you build a plow in order to produce something else, wheat. Or you build a steam engine to have textiles, or an industrial robot in order to assemble Teslas or BYDs or whatever. But what lives in those laptops and tablets and smartphones of ours is a produced means. It's a machine, but it doesn't produce anything except a remarkable, exorbitant power to modify our behavior. This is algorithmic capital, if you want. I call it cloud capital because supposedly it lives. So my
Let me pick up on, cloud capital.
But let me just end it because it brings it together.
Yeah,
so what I'm saying is that we have a new form of capital, which just like the steam engines of yesteryear, caused a major transformation from feudalism to capitalism. We allowed this cloud capital, surreptitiously, without even noticing that it happened, to replace markets with digital platforms, which are not markets, they look like markets, but they're more like cloud fiefdoms, and to replace profit, capitalist profit, with a form of ground rent, which is of course not ground rent, it's cloud rent. And this is a completely different game that we are finding ourselves in.
Well, let me pursue that line about cloud capitalism. You put it in, you've sort of given me a sense of what you mean, but I want to push you.
Sure.
How would you define cloud capital?
Machines, which are networked with one another, capable of training us, to train them to know us better, win our trust, and then once they have our trust, automatically, without any human participation in this, to input desires into our mind. And once we have those desires, to satiate those desires by selling us the stuff that we now desire, bypassing every market.
A closed system.
Well, that's no longer capitalism. Welcome to techno-feudalism.
Okay. Well, let me talk about the feudalism part of it. So a company owns every part of the market, is effectively what you're saying.
It doesn't own a market. It owns a fiefdom, which is not a market. There is economic activity on that fiefdom. There is buying and there is selling. But it's not a market. Because think of Amazon.com, Roger. Right? I mean, there are millions of buyers, millions of sellers. But there is no degree of decentralization whatsoever. In a sense, and I think somebody like you with your experience in politics and economics and so on will appreciate that, it resembles, at least from where I'm standing, the wet dream of the Soviet economic planners. What did they want to? They wanted to replace the market with an algorithm. They used pen and paper back then, cybernetics, in the ministry, the Gospel ministry, if you remember, in Moscow, in order to match producers and consumers outside the context of the market. Well, this is what Jeff Bezos' algorithm does. When you are in Amazon.com, you don't get to choose whose wares you're going to see. The algorithm chooses that. It might, if you and I have our tablets and we punch in, let's say, electric bicycles, we'll get different vendors, you and I, because it all depends on the algorithm's capacity to predict what is the maximum rent Bezos can make from the bicycle producer when Bezos matches particular producers to us. That is not a market. So they don't own a market. They own a cloud fiefdom, a digital fiefdom, and they collect ground rent or cloud rent up to 40% of the price of the electric bicycle. That's not a market.
Okay, now our terminology is really interesting in this, because you're talking about feudalism, you're talking about a fief, you're talking about rent. This sounds like pre-capitalism almost. Is that really what you're saying? We're going back to some sort of medieval system?
No, we're going forward to something far worse than what we had. And I say this as a leftist critic of capitalism. What we now end up having, techno-feudalism, is something far worse. It's a mistake to think that we're going back, because there are huge differences between feudalism and what I call techno-feudalism. So, for instance, Jeff Bezos was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Feudal lords, the landed gentry, all they had to do to be feudal lords was to be born in the right family. Now, Jeff Bezos is a very smart man. Whether you like him or not is another matter. He is a capitalist. He invests in cloud capital, huge quantities of money. The fact that most of it comes from the central bank, or came from the central bank as part of quantitative easing, but that's another story, is neither here nor there. So it's a capitalist enterprise, but the form of capital that he is using is creating a new form of rent, which resembles feudal ground rent, but it is based on new, old singing, old dancing machinery, capital goods. Look, my personal views are not particularly material here. I personally think that the technology on which crypto, Bitcoin, is based is fascinating. But I don't believe in a privatized version of money. I don't believe in what I call the apolitical fantasy, or the fantasy of apolitical money that will replace the pound, the yen, the dollar, and the euro, and so on and so forth. But that's neither here nor there. What is happening in the United States is fascinating. Because on the one hand, you correctly pointed out that Donald Trump was not a great believer in crypto. But the fact of the matter is that a very large section of his constituency, the MAGA constituency, the people who follow people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, they are libertarians within MAGA. And they loathe the state. They loathe, at least ideologically, from an ethical point of view, the Federal Reserve, fiat money, state money. And for them, the idea of apolitical money, that is the kind of digital gold, Bitcoin or Ethereum and so on, is appealing to them. So on the one hand, Trump is very cynical. That is, he's bolstering the crypto reserves of his friends who have, within the MAGA movement, invested in it. Let's not forget that him and Melania actually issued their own meme currencies, cryptocurrencies, and they made hundreds of millions of dollars. So he always likes a quick buck, doesn't he? But besides that, Alexis, I think, well, yes, absolutely. And the fact is that, look, when average opinion is trying to second guess average opinion, anything is possible. The sky's the limit, and you can go all the way down to zero. But what is driving there is an objective demand for crypto that comes from crime, from terrorists. It comes from friends of mine who have been, like Julian Assange, for instance, who was completely blocked from any access he had to MasterCard, to Visa, and so on. So there is a utility in the cryptocurrencies. What I find interesting and potentially lethal for financial stability is the so-called stablecoins. Now, for the benefit of our audience who don't know what they are, just very briefly, if you buy one of those stablecoins, the company that issues it guarantees, or says that it guarantees, the parity between, the dollar and one of those stablecoins. So one stablecoin is $1, and therefore, supposedly, it offers you some kind of security, some kind of insurance from fluctuations of this currency. Now, for this to work, that company would have to have somewhere hoarded an equal number of dollars as the stablecoins that it issues. Of course, they never do that, and nobody checks them. It's a bit like the gold standard before, 1930. Nobody could have checked whether governments have as much gold as they say they have in order to back gold-backed sterling or dollars and so on. Which means that if people believe that these stable coins are worth their salt, they're worth the guarantee that they are being sold with, then a lot of money is going to flow into them because it gives you a lot more flexibility regarding making payments, receiving payments. But the more people trust that, the greater the incentive of the companies that issue them to fib, to say that they do have the dollars that are necessary to back up those stable coins without having it. And therefore, this, for me, is a clear and present danger for a future financial clash or crash.
What about Europe, Yanis? I mean, your home, your area where you have been in government, of course, in the past. What can Europe make of these challenges and opportunities that they've got? I mean, is it an opportunity as well as a challenge in terms of what you're talking about?
It's a fantastic opportunity, one that we are certainly going to miss. Certainly. Why? Because of the mishandling of the euro crisis. The euro crisis was another opportunity to consolidate, to create a political union, which is essential. Roger, we created a federal money without a federal treasury. It was dumb. The euro crisis, following the Wall Street collapse, gave us an opportunity to correct that. Instead, we did everything we could not to do it. Angela Merkel had the political capital to, give a speech and say, guys, girls, this is the time for us to create a federal Europe. Either you do away with the federal money or you create a federal treasury. And if you're going to create a federal treasury, you might as well do it democratically so that you have a democratic legitimacy for imposing taxes, for borrowing on behalf of everyone. And we didn't do that. And now you can see the political fragmentation. Emmanuel Macron is a lame duck president. Goodness knows what will happen in the next presidential election. But whatever happens, France is not going to have a government that is capable of answering these questions.
And Germany?
Germany is gone. It's deindustrializing fast. It is now moving from being a fiscally conservative place to a fiscally irresponsible place.
They shouldn't have got rid of the Black Sea.
Not for that reason. Not in order to buy weaponry, which we really neither need nor want.
Neither need nor want?
Neither need nor want. This idea that the tragedy which is unfolding in Ukraine is a reason for us to replace Volkswagen plants with Rheinmetall plants producing Leopard tanks, which even if you go to war, they are completely useless, as the Ukraine war has proven. But the only reason why they're doing it is because they need to replace, Volkswagen cannot sell cars. So now we have to buy Leopard tanks that we neither need nor want. I insist on this, but that's another conversation. The thing is that the mishandling of the Euro crisis led to a political paralysis, which makes this conversation impossible. They're not having it in Brussels. They simply come out with these ridiculous military Keynesian programs. Before that, remember, it was a Green Deal. What happened to that 1 trillion euros that was going to be spent on the Green Deal? It never existed. Because, this is what, after the Wall Street collapse and the Euro crisis, all you get from Brussels is smoke and mirrors.
And with all this analysis, Yanis, yourself,
yes,
you are formerly in government. You have, by your book and for everything else, you have some answers you believe in. Would you yourself personally go back into politics?
I am in politics. I'm heading a political party in Greece, a small political party in Greece. We are active in places like Germany. We are active in Italy. Next month I'm going to Oslo for the election campaign there, in view of the elections in September. I never left politics. As Tony Benn once said, I left Parliament in order to become more engaged in politics. So what can be done? So, because I'm a leftist, an unreconstructed Marxist, as I'm sure you will say at some point, or remind our audience, for me the solution always is this: not the nationalization, because I have an antipathy towards the state, but the socialization of apps, of algorithms. So, for instance, why should taxi drivers subscribe to Uber and have so much value being taken away from them and sent to the Cayman Islands, because this is where it ends up, right? Why can't they be a cooperative using an application? Why can't the municipality in which we live or the region have an app instead of Airbnb so that the value stays within the community? Why can't the community decide the rules of this communal, socially owned Airbnb, the rules by which, the renting out of apartments proceeds? So that is, if you want, the left-wing, socialist-leaning, my kind of solution. But even at a much lower level of engagement, let's say that tomorrow the House of Commons in this country, or whoever in the European Union, it's a maze there.
Commission, let's say.
Yeah, introduces a very simple rule that to operate in our jurisdiction, you have to allow for interoperability. What does that mean? Let me give you an example. I don't know about you, but when Elon Musk went haywire, I wanted to leave X, Twitter. But I can't leave Twitter. I'm a prisoner because I have, 1.2 million followers.
There are alternatives. Blue Sky?
Yes, and I went. But in Blue Sky I had 10 followers. In Twitter I had 1.2 million. Now, interoperability would solve this problem because it would impose, in the same way that once upon a time, remember, with telecoms, they were forced by law to allow you to take a telephone number from one company to another to create competition. Imagine if Twitter was or X was forced, if when I post something on Blue Sky, to transmit it to my followers in Twitter. That would be an amazing breakthrough in combating the exorbitant power of these techno-feudal lords. So you can do anything from that degree of minimalist but important and substantial legislation all the way to socializing the means of communication. It's not in the air. But this is the beauty, the wild beauty of politics and of democratic politics. We're here to have this debate. The first step towards overthrowing and overturning exorbitant absolute power is to realize that it exists, that you're subject to it, and then to agitate, and then to have this, to do what we're doing now, and then to build a democratic process up so that you can take away that exorbitant privilege from the the latter-day feudal lords and transfer it to where it belongs. And I am mortified by this show of utter disregard for basic human decency. No doubt about that. The way that Elon Musk walked into the federal government departments and essentially plugged his cloud capital, what I call cloud capital, into the public cloud capital, and essentially to usurp all the data. It's a regime change that harks back to the mid-war period of the fascist takeover of the states.
You see it in
like the Nixon shock in 1971. Nixon went, then Carter came. Exactly the same policy of the Nixon shock continued. So we have to brace ourselves. The Chinese know that, and they've been bracing themselves. And I think they've already oriented themselves towards creating, to put it bluntly, a new Bretton Woods amongst the BRICS, with associate members from the United Arab Emirates to Saudi Arabia, maybe to some European countries. And this is now, they say they are being extremely conservative, the Chinese. They are not making big noises. They are, taking it slowly. They are still waiting, just in case Trump sees some degree of reason. They are not selling their American treasuries. They could do this. They are not doing that. They don't want their currency to replace the dollar. But if pushed, they are going to turn the BRICS into a new Bretton Woods. Because remember, Bretton Woods was a system whose purpose was to maintain in the center the United States as a surplus country. Because after the Second World War, America had a huge trade surplus with the rest of us. With the United States using its currency, the dollar, as an anchor for all our other currencies. So this is the plan for the BRICS Plus. It's not to create an alternative currency, it's to create a trading group which is...
A trading group still using the dollar?
Self-sufficient. No. If pushed, they're going to replace it with they have the digital payment systems, they have the digital currency issued some years ago by the Chinese central bank. Now there are about 200 million accounts, including foreign accounts, using this digital wallet. There is WeChat, an amazing application which you could have as long as you wanted to make payments in one. So the world seems to be moving towards a bifurcation, at least to very, very different agglomerations. For many, many years, the stock markets in the United States have been booming. They never had it so good. But at the same time, Main Street, the average blokes and girls out there in the United States suffered. And that's the reason why Donald Trump was reelected. So Donald Trump's prospects, political prospects, will depend not so much on Wall Street, but on whether he manages to boost the economy at the lower end of the social stratum and hierarchy. For him to succeed in doing this, there may have to be a correction in the markets. So seeing the small, and they are small, drops in the stock exchanges, in Nasdaq, in Wall Street, and so on. Well, that's not necessarily a sign that his policies are flailing. The true test will be whether there is going to be any degree of reindustrialization. We already see capital flowing from Germany, from France, from Italy, into the United States. We already see BASF, the great chemical giant, relocating to the United States. That is going to determine whether the new administration's policy works or not. From the perspective of the European Union, Well, the European Union has been stagnating now for 15 years. We've missed out on an industrial revolution. We had zero net investment for 15 years. This is why Germany is deindustrializing. So you're absolutely right, Alexis. This was the time when the European Union should get together and, take a good look at itself in the mirror, come to the conclusion that we have failed Europe because we have not done anything really to divert liquidity, masses of liquidity. Don't forget that, the European Central Bank printed more than 6,000 billion euros, and almost none of that went into investment. And do something about it. Instead, we have